Hello, I'm Jane Affleck. I'm the manager of Keswick Museum. I'm here today to interview Hannah Fox, who's the story researcher for our Telt project here at Keswick Museum. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, and I'm Hannah Fox. I have been appointed as the story researcher for the project, which is about storytelling with and for Keswick Museum. And I've been in post for, about 18 months, just a little bit longer. And I've been working on a 2 day a week basis on this project.
Great, nice. Thank you very much. So we'll start with our questions. Can you talk to me about your planned approach that led you to achieve the project outcomes?
Yes. So the purpose of this project, as was defined by Keswick Museum before I was on board, was to explore, record, and celebrate the cultural heritage of storytelling local to Cumbria, both the stories and those who tell them. So that was my uh, headline. That was what I had to achieve with this project, which was extraordinarily potentially broad and open. And it was my job to give that some structure and to deliver that. So, my approach that I developed to kind of hit that brief was to essentially think that the museum in Keswick was the hub, the home of the project, but that really the project was Cumbria wide. And I had to go out from the museum to explore and to seek out and to find people and stories and the act of storytelling as broadly as I could in Cumbria. Um, so that was a really important approach. Cumbria is a vast and a varied county, and it was really important to get the message about this work out, to be communicated as widely as possible in geographically, but also sort of demographically, if that's a word, in terms of sort of across sections of society, because Cumbria is such a varied place. It was also important, I felt, in the approach, as Keswick Museum do also, that we were finding real voices. Yes, there are some professional storytellers in Cumbria, but we weren't seeking those people. We were seeking voices of everyday people who had potentially a story to share with us. And it was really important to us that we maintained the kind of quality of real voices in this. Um, and also, it was important to, as well as gather stories, find stories, generate potentially stories, it was important to take the work that we had gathered back to the museum, almost back out on the road, to make what we had gathered visible again, to go back to the original statement at the top there, to celebrate. So we explored, we recorded, but then we celebrated by taking it out again. And one of the approaches I had to this was really from the get-go, knowing how projects need to have a strong framework, was to create something that was, it seems like a little bit shallow, but it had to have a distinct look, name, and a kind of graphic. So really from quite early on, we decided upon a name which was felt like a little bit of a dialect name, Telt. It's very Cumbrian. We worked with a brilliant designer who created a graphic logo. We produced some big, pleasing postcards, and some banners, some pop-up banners. And this is all by way of going, this is our project. This is a vessel that we're going to fill. And actually that kind of look and that graphic and that sort of palette, I suppose, served us really well, because it definitely was a clear flagging up for people that, oh, it's us, this is what we're doing.
Great. That's a really interesting explanation of the whole project as a big wide thing. It was a large project. Can you please describe how you modelled the structure of the project? So what you did to create to to do what you um, to do what you did, shall we say?
Yes, so Knowing the purpose and deciding upon a general approach, I broke the project down with the kind of in discussion with Keswick Museum, broke the project into a kind of three-stage structure, which was extremely distinct, and I think served the project well. Um, there were three stages. The first stage, which was about a third from the early summer, late spring, early summer, when I came on board, to about the end of the year. So through the summer, autumn, and into the earlier stages of winter, which was about going out, meeting people, and finding stories. That was like stage one, which I'll talk more about in a minute. Stage two was the pulling together of what I'd found and to create an exhibition in the museum. The project had to deliver a visible outcome in the museum, which was a massive, kind of like summer, autumn, winter exhibition. That was stage two, which I'll talk more about. And stage three was, interestingly, that didn't mark the end of the project. Then, once the exhibition was in place, we then went back out onto the road, taking the work to celebrate out and about again. And we found a way to do that I think was interesting, which I'll talk about. So, stage one, what did I do? I went out to find people and stories. This took different forms, and what I did, this is a sort of a bit of an overview here, but what I did is I attended things that were already happening in Cumbria, that had already had some sort of legs, as it were. So I attended really grassroots events that were sort of that people attended in Cumbria. So things like Keswick Spring Show, agricultural shows at Coniston and Lowick and so on. These are the shows where, farmers come to show their stock, people celebrate the growing of their vegetables. There is like Cumberland and Westmoreland wrestling, things like this. So I went to events. I went to talks that were very specific, like talks about with interest groups like Borrowdale mining talks. So specific interest groups, Furness traditions, Stealing Thunder story walks. So things were already happening. And I met people at these events. I talked to people. I either gathered there and then some stories. I had really fantastic recording equipment that we'd bought for the project, a little mobile voice recorder. Or I just told people about the project to start to develop some sort of hooks of relationships with people. I went to community groups, which, for example, groups that Rosehill Theatre run on the West Coast. They are very grassroots community support groups. And I went to even kind of highbrow things like a Norman Nicholson symposium to meet with kind of people that were already working in kind of with words and literature in Cumbria. So I attended things. I also I asked for direct meetings with people, partly through people I've met through those events I've just talked about. So I went to find people. I set up via email meetings, and people like Mark Goodwin, who's a town crier in Maryport, specific individuals like a guy called Jacob, who lives in Keswick, who's a young physiotherapist who I know, he told me he had some stories. People led to people. So I met a young man called Bobby Guard Story, who led me to another. He's a stonewaller. He led me to a fantastic young folk musician, Holly Clark, who shared some amazing stories. So I had direct meetings, and also some direct meetings that I asked for with groups like there's Colours Cafe in Whitehaven, who are an LGBTQ plus kind of support group. I found them through going to Rosehill Theatre, for example. So often things led to things, direct meetings. I also ran some workshops in this time, which were things like creative writing workshops, creative story crafting workshops, and bookmaking workshops. And I did those out in the community, for example, at Maryport Library. For adults, this was at Maryport Library. Family groups also, actually, at Rosehill, again, family days that they were running. I ran workshops to try and see that would draw stories out of people, and if people might create stories. and also ran workshops, and also just sort of courted some possible future leads that I knew might come to pass later. So, for example, Barrow Archives, cafes, Chinty's Cafe in Keswick, pubs and bars in and around Keswick that were running open mic nights. I thought they could be useful relationships for the future. The Rotary Club I had meetings with, Keswick Library, and starting to make some relationships with future events like Eskfest or Cumberlandia, that's a new Cumbria festival. So knowing that these are kind of warming up some relationships for what might come next. And of course, we did our own museum-based activities, which it wasn't all out and about. Most of it was, but we did our own in the museum. So we had Jessie Binns, who's a really good storyteller, come in and share stories. That was a kind of open family day there. Saudi celebrations were happening in that year, so we brought this project Telt into that, a whole strand of that. Tuesday's Tonic happens in the museum, and that's a group who meet regularly, and I brought Telt to that. We had schools days in the museum, and I brought Telt to that on a kind of rotation. There was lots of activities happening. Oh, one of them's Telt, and the children came from local schools to celebrate stories, to make stories, to hear stories. And also, for example, we had a big day where a home ed support group came to the museum, and we spent the day making stories, which again led to a future relationship. And finally, in this first stage of going out and how did I meet people, find stories, gather stories, we had a further development, which was we decided to do some active sort of story creation sessions, I suppose, which was I appointed a writer called Adam Holton, who specializes in flash fiction, which means that there you are on the street, you're making stories with people there and then, which I'll talk about later. But we did that. We actively asked if we could go to Winter Droving at Penrith, which is a festival, and the Dickensian Festival down in Ulverston, and we ran this kind of activity where absolutely loads of stories were generated off the cuff with local people at those events, which later led into the exhibition. So that's a huge summary, really, of the modeling of the project. We spoke about the structure. That was stage one, going out. How do I find these stories? Stage two was the making of the exhibition. This is the winter now. We've kind of got to the winter, and we're needing to spend 2 or 3 months now working towards the creating of the exhibition, which was to open in spring. We have a lot of material at this point, and we have a lot of stories. And to make the exhibition be engaging, inviting, interesting, and also kind of have an architecture to it, we decided to group the stories in the exhibition into distinct areas, as if these are the stories that you might hear in these places. So 6 areas, down the pub, at the bus stop, and so on. We can talk about those later, but there are 6 areas that in those areas, which were quite theatrically framed, a sitting space. It was really important to have a place to kind of dwell, as they call it, a dwell space. We didn't have headphones, but we had an audio player. So in each of those distinct places, you could hear, by pressing a button, the stories that had been gathered. And there were a real range of long ones, short ones, deep and strange, sort of almost ghost stories, to quirky, funny kind of tall tales, really. So the creation of the exhibition was we collaborated with a couple of people, like a good sound technician and a maker. So we pulled the exhibition together, and we also decided at this point to create a newspaper. And we did this, which was a kind of selection of some of the stories printed in a proper newspaper format, and we called it the Telt Telegraph. And the reason we did this is that we wanted something really pleasing and tangible to be able to leave the exhibition with people for free. People could take them away. And also it was a way to kind of make evident that we, in the project, are trying to communicate that stories are a living thing, they're an evolving thing, they're a changing thing, they're an everyday thing. They're not like a simply a precious thing that needs to go in a book and on a library shelf. It's they are as usable, as it malleable, and as kind of consumable and as shareable as a newspaper. You know, next thing, you know, the newspaper's in the bin, and it's about kind of trying to liberate the act of story sharing and storytelling to make it feel like it's everybody's. So that was the end of me talking about the exhibition stage of the modelled project. The third and final stage, once the exhibition was open, was to go back out on the road. And how we did that was we had a little device, which was we created a story trunk, which looked very quirky. It was a nice big old sort of traveling trunk covered in stickers. We converted it to be a sound system, and it had an amp and it had a speaker and it had a battery inside it and a volume button. What that meant was that we could take a mobile version of the exhibition back out on the road, and that was back to me. I was doing that. And I then capitalized on some of those early relationships I said I made previously, a few months earlier. And I took that story trunk with our cards, our newspaper, our pull up banners. So it's all very clearly a kind of a strong project. I took it to Eskfest, Cumberlandia, storytelling festival in South Cumbria called Stealing Thunder. Let me remember the other ones. Keswick Show, and out and about to these events whereby I could then shout about the project, share the project, and also communicate that there's a big exhibition in Keswick if people had time and wanted to go and see it there. So this is a little miniature version of that, really. And the other thing that I did distinctly in this period of the project, once the exhibition was up and running, was I worked back with the Home Ed group, but I went to their venue this time, and I did 2 or 3 days with them where they were making stories. Interestingly, that led to a whole other exhibition downstairs in Keswick Museum in the community gallery, where the young people from the Home Ed group made some more stories. We illustrated them. We have an exhibition there. And then again, that led to another nice link, which was back with the Tuesdays Tonic group. They collaborated with the Home Ed young people in a way where they also had a story present in the community gallery, illustrated in a similar way. So really lovely links. So that was another part of the outreach work once the exhibition was up and running. And also, I towards the end of the year, I did some work around some extra workshops. Like, for example, I went into Keswick Library and I did a further workshop there. All of these things are to deliver there and then at the coalface, but to signpost people back to the exhibition. And we had a fabulous celebration day in Keswick where we appointed a fabulous other professional storyteller, Emily Hennessy, to share some of our stories. She told our stories back in those venues, as I mentioned, such as Chinty's Cafe and the library and a pub in Keswick. So we shouted about the exhibition again there. She shared the work, and that was a bit of a Pied Piper situation whereby we gathered people in town who then came back to the museum that day. Felt a little bit like kind of end of year winter celebration where we had some soup and we shared the stories. So in a way, all of that goes to show how the project was a bit like a weaving. So, you know, you start with this and there's a thread here, there's a thread there, but a lot of these threads were able to be kind of pulled back in and stitched back in and tied onto something else. So essentially, not really anything was lost. Most things, because of the nature of the project, were able to be kind of built back in, stitched back in to the full tapestry, I would say, of Telt.
That's excellent. It's a really it's nice to hear how collaborative it was and how so many of the different elements that you worked with then worked with other groups and kind of participated together rather than a single independent connections. That it's, as you say, very much a tapestry. that's all woven together. That sounds really amazing. Can I ask what you learned about Cumbria and storytelling during the process? Um, and also, if you had to change and shift as you went because of things that you learned and discovered.
Mm. So, what did I learn about Cumbria during this process? I was surprised how shy Cumbrians are about sharing their stories. And I've started, through the process, I think I started to realize that I'm not in Ireland now. And what I mean by that is when I've spent time in Ireland, for example, I feel like people are more enabled to share their culture, to shout about their stories, their songs, their history, all these things. And I think that in Cumbria, people aren't so there with that. They're not so enabled. And um, I found that the stories weren't hugely visible, really, or on the surface, such as in other places I've been to. And there's just less confidence around feeling like you're a storyteller or that your story is interesting or valid, I would say. Um, I, I've talked with quite a few people in this project, and I'm wondering about whether it's partly because the Lake District is a kind of the star of the show in Cumbria. And if you're a Cumbrian who isn't particularly working in the kind of Lake District tourist industry, or you're maybe not physically living in that central section, you might be up in the north or on the coast or right down in Barrow or so on. I think you potentially feel a bit like you're not your story isn't so relevant. Um, so that's what I kind of feel like I learned in this process. And so some shifts I needed to kind of work with around this sort of timidity a little bit about sharing, having the confidence to share, was that I just really, really had to nurture relationships and build a hugely warm sense of trust with people. Um, and provide opportunities for people to share, because people do have stories and they do come out, but you sometimes had to work quite hard to create those moments and opportunities. Um, so one of the distinct developments that I had to kind of roll with, develop here, was I had to think on my feet quite a lot, really, I think, on this project. What one of the key changes or shifts, I suppose, I made was to create these opportunities for these flash fiction pop-up story making sessions, um, which were about creating new stories, but in a way it was also about saying story making and storytelling is a living craft. That's what we modeled by doing this, and we demonstrated it, and it was completely delightful. It was, people were, when we oiled the wheels of being able to create stories, those wheels rolled really well. So it wasn't a struggle once we just thought, we just need to give this a little bit of fuel here. So what we did with that is we popped up at winter droving in Penrith, and we would have done more. Would have been amazing to have done loads and loads of this, but we did these two distinct things, and Dickensian Festival, where people were given a map of Cumbria anywhere they wanted. We made sure we had a kind of full geographical spread of Cumbria from every particular nook and cranny and all the outreach. They chose a place, they chose a name of a character and a couple of words, and then Adam, the story writer, in front of their eyes on a typewriter, typed a story, just A5, quite short, and gave it to them as a gift. And it was something that people took away with completely sort of delight and kind of precious feeling of it being a gift, but also it came from them. The content was theirs. and it was rooted in Cumbria because it was absolutely about a place, a village, a street, a fell top, a beach, whatever. So that was something that we did to enable the project, and something to do with Cumbrians being a little bit reluctant. I feel. I wonder if there's anything else to say about that. Oh, and the other thing that we did, which I was talking about, making some shifts, and this research-led sort of project, having to kind of follow my instinct quite a lot, was that I definitely felt that piggybacking on other people's strong groups that were already developed groups was a really positive way of doing things. So, for example, in Whitehaven, there's a project called Kind, Kind, and it's about kind of bringing people together for lunch. It's a warm hub, and they do creative sessions. So I went into their group to work with people. They already know each other. They feel safe in that space. I'm the visitor. And we had some really lovely session of hearing stories, gathering stories, sharing stories, recording stories. Or, for example, the home ed group. They know each other well. They meet. They're looking for really interesting activities. So sometimes going to an existing group got me really far down the road of finding, gathering, and creating stories.
That's really interesting to hear. I think we from the museum have tried a lot to create events and activities in groups, and it is a very slow burn from the start. It takes an awful lot of time to develop these and to gain an audience, a regular audience, and then once you've got the audience, to gain their trust and their commitment to participate in things and to then share as well, because that's another step on. And with a project and a grant funded project, you often don't have the time to start that relationship from zero. So by working with groups that have already been set up, that you go to, is much more efficient use of time. But it does mean that once a project ends, those groups carry on, but they're not at the museum. So those links are there, but not physically there, because the groups don't meet at the museum, other than the ones that we already had running. So that's a really interesting learning point from the project, I feel. So thanks for sharing that.
Mm.
My next question, how did you tackle with any difficulties that you met with?
So, yeah, I mean, I touched upon the kind of slight reluctance of Cumbrians, really, to kind of, I think people just are getting on with their lives and their work. And so, really, just a lot of perseverance and time, and using the group model that I've just spoken about, such as at Rose Hill. I felt like something people were secure with when I was working with them was maps, because when you refer it back to the ground where we live, that suddenly kind of seemed to just help. So I did it. That's one of the ways it was almost a bit of a safety blanket, comfort blanket for me and them, really, about going, okay, have you got any stories from this valley? Or should we share a story about this harbour, or should we make a story about this tarn? Suddenly that kind of, it's as if a little bell went off for people, because it was about landscape, because we live in a place that we are saturated by the fact that we live in a beautiful landscape. We're told about the landscape, even when those people aren't living in the Lake District, but on the outer edges, we're still very there. Those communities are very connected often to the sea. So it was very meaningful for people, the maps. And even another example of something where I went to do with difficulties and sort of reluctance and a kind of timidity around sharing and creating, because you have to maybe have been, I think it's that thing, isn't it? Like kind of see it to be it, that phrase people use, where if you've never seen people making or crafting a story, or what, or sharing a story, even like how would you? So another thing I did in one group was we made a group story, and that was really interesting. We stood up, we were physical, and we made it a bit more like a game, and um, so nobody had the spotlight just on them, and that was really really lovely. It was quite a big group, kind of about 12 people, and it was almost like a kind of progressive story that seemed to work really well. One of the other difficulties I had was that it was a project, as we know, that wasn't about social history. It wasn't like I'm going out there to record people's um, stories around social history. That's a different project. This was a project more about myth, folklore, fairy tales, tall tales, ghost stories, kind of those other kinds of narratives, I suppose. And even sometimes when I would make that, I would feel explicitly clear in a conversation or a group. People would still tell me their social history. So that was something that I did quite often have to just hold quite carefully, because I didn't want to dismiss people's story about, you know, when this happened or when that happened. But I had to be respectful of those things, but try and just slightly steer towards something else. One of the methods I used, which is very subtle and I think probably helped a bit, was that right at the beginning we called the project Telt, because as soon as you use the word story, that can feel like social history stories, like your family story or whatever. The word tale has a slightly different sort of emphasis, so that was an absolute choice that we made right at the beginning. But yeah, there were ways to overcome those difficulties.
I think you're right. The switch from the project's name of storytellers into tale telt um, was was really significant, and very much changed it, as you said, from life stories into fiction. And as we imagined it right from the start, it was very much tales around the fireside, you know, um, being read to, or being told stories and tales, and how that then influences and changes as they are reread and retold and passed on. Uh,
Mm.
but it's rightly say, it's difficult to express that um, to the public, and you don't want to dismiss them if they're telling you their life story, because there may well be something at the end of it. So that's really interesting to hear your approach to how you handled that, because I do think that that was something that we struggled with in the early days to make clear. So thank you. Um, it does seem that relationships have been key. How did you invest in those and to be able to capitalize on them?
Yeah, so yeah, it was all about relationships. And as I think we spoke about earlier, kind of one thing often led to another thing. And that was about trust, of course. Like nobody would pass you on to their neighbor up the road if they didn't trust that the relationship was a good one. Um, I pretty much tried to remain really flexible and make it easy for people. So I would go to them all the time, and that was a really kind of lovely, and I like that, like a really varied way of going about things. So um, I had to, these people were I retired, or they had no transport, or they were working and they were very busy people. So I would tend to try and go out of my way to kind of show up where they needed me to show up, to make it easy for them. Um, and the relationships, as we say, are based on trust. So often there were very long lead times. I remember one particular person who I think I maybe had about 3 meetings with him. It was actually, we met at Keswick Museum and we chewed the fat for a very long time, because he was really uh, like an important character, important figure locally, and I knew he had a lot to give, but he wasn't going to give it away easily. So often the lead times were quite long before anything was kind of harvested, let's say, being in the form of stories. And the relationships when people were quite reluctant or whatever was that I was constantly emphasizing, I think, the fact that everyone is a storyteller, everyone has got interesting stories to tell, and we worked with two or three professional storytellers, but we were so far tilted away from that to try and give people the confidence to say, no, you are the person that we want to meet with today and hear your story. So giving people confidence and being flexible. And also knowing how to make, when it came to the crafting of the exhibition, having to make a good exhibition means that you have to make selections, and it's not a vessel for everything you've gathered. Everything's safe and recorded and there, but you also have to curate that and make an exhibition that's then going to function as an exhibition for people that haven't been part of the project, who are a visitor coming in. So that's when you kind of have to slightly shift your head into making some kind of key choices about what's relevant, what's going to work in the exhibition setting.
Great, thank you. Um, I'll move on to a slightly different subject, which is the audiences that you've been and the different groups that you've met with. Clearly, you've had a really strong engagement with lots of new audiences, and that seems to be really very rich. Can you talk about this a little, please?
Yes, I think one of the most thrilling things that I've discovered myself, not didn't anticipate this at all, was that how strongly young people feel about their folklore, about folklore really, and it's really exciting. I Some of the most avid contributors to the project have been young people. I mean, I would say, when I say young people, I mean people in their 30s and a bit younger. And these aren't people, some of them are kind of people in the, there's one particular person who's a musician, so I would say she's in the arts, but other people are not in the arts, as it were. They're working people in Cumbria, but there's actually a really strong desire for people to celebrate folklore, and that's been brilliant. I've been really pleased and kind of excited to see this. There's one particular person, Jonathan Howie in Kendal, who is so interested in local folklore that he produces a magazine, a kind of a really beautiful publication, I'd call it. And I think he's on to number 3 now, and that is all about contemporary folklore. So yes, the old stories, but also he is somebody who's also separately from us, working over there in Kendal. He's also working on how folklore and story is it's a living thing. So people now, maybe, for example, contemporary situations whereby people cold water swimming and diving for lost junk slash treasure, it becomes a whole folk story, a folklore of its own, or cave culture, or music sharing at midsummer, or all these things that he is also sort of celebrating in his work. He's been quite heavily part of our project. I managed to get him involved in the exhibition a little bit, and we've subsequently become a piece of writing in his publication, which is brilliant. Again, that threads and that tapestry weaving together. So I think new audiences has been what I've been most excited by, that it's not, it was important for us to capture stories that were going to be lost, but I'm really pleased to say that I feel like story sharing and the importance of stories is something that it does have a future. I can see that younger people are picking up the baton. I think there's been a lull I definitely do think from the old folks, as you'd say, to this young generation now, I definitely think there is and was a huge void and an aversion to your kind of grassroots culture and sharing of that. But I think we might have just turned the tide with this, where there are young folk musicians now and young people interested in folklore, and I think maybe it's going to come. Maybe there's going to be a new kind of rise in that. I think.
Do you think taking our um, uh, branded, visible project with its name across the county so widely has maybe opened people's eyes to the possibility of tales and storytelling, and so that they then might want to seek out that younger group that might be more um, niche, should we say? So I think that the younger audience that you talk about um, speak widely, maybe between themselves, but less widely to the wider Cumbrian community, and that maybe as Keswick Museum and what we did kind of bridged that gap.
Yeah, quite possibly. I think. I mean, I'm remembering sort of situations through the summer when I went back out after we had the exhibition in place and I went back out on the road with that trunk that I was talking about, actively went to sort of to festivals that had sort of multi-generational, but for example, just witnessing people at Fest, which is a kind of folky it's not well, it's a music festival, and you know young dudes sitting by the trunk in their kind of festival hats, reading our newspaper. I'm thinking, it's before me now. They're they're absorbing here this project. I think the fact that the project looked clear and graphic and strong, we did ourselves a massive favor with that. We didn't look like some sort of woolly vague thing that wouldn't be interesting. We looked interesting from the get-go because it was well designed visually. um and I think maybe also those pop-up flash fiction sessions which meant that we had sometimes, gang of kind of three lads in the space. It was like an open gazebo space, but it was very visual. So like three lads, and then the next time they would walk out and they would see an old couple coming in, and they would walk out and they'd see like a mother and a daughter, sort of teenage daughter coming in. So everybody could see everybody else's interest in something like this, and it wasn't sort of restricted to just a young people's event or just an older person's event. And I think demonstrating and modeling like this is always a fantastic thing to do. I would say a festival like Cumberlandia, it was more of a kind of middle-aged demographic there. At Cumblandia, but then at Stealing Thunder Storytelling Festival, which we took the trunk to, then it would be again, young and old again. So I think, to answer your question about is it niche, I think it is niche. I think there were pockets of this here and there around the place, but I think maybe what we did was just sort of blew some air through that, and is nothing better than just shining a light and everybody can see. And I think that's maybe what we did in our small way. And yeah, I think I can't, I'm sure those newspapers have gone far and wide. People have taken them away and left them, on the table at home, and somebody else will have picked it up and got, what's this? And then so I think those little fingers have gone out and gone on. And yeah, I think we did our part in that.
That's great. As you said, Cumbria is a really large county, very varied from um, the very picturesque central Lake District with its tourism and potentially um, kind of exclusive, dare I say it, population who can afford to live in that area, and then so the edge, the bit that encircles it, from coast but also inland, the Eden Valley, all of those areas. You reached out across the whole of that area. How did how did that impact you, the sort of the distance, but also the geography and the differences in geography? How did that impact the project, do you think?
I think the geography of Cumbria means that I had to take it on the chin and I had to go to people, because often, as we know in these areas, that, some people, like, travel and transport is an issue for quite a lot of people. People don't like to travel, or they don't have the means to travel, and the weather can impact people and not wanting to drive in the ice or drive after dark and so on. So in a way, I had to get on with that, and I had to go to people. And also, some of these communities are quite isolated, so it's not really even in their normal kind of expectation to go anywhere. Especially some of the West Coast communities, they it's quite rare that they'll go a distance to attend something. Like I've experienced that. I think a lot of Cumbrian organisations have, where people go, "Oh, I haven't been there." Keswick Museum might be only in Keswick to you and I, but it's not very far down the road, but it's seen as a million miles away when you live on the other side of that hill, and the buses aren't great, and you've got no car. So it's quite surprising how compact some people's geographical lives are. So I had to go to people, which I actually really enjoyed. And as I say, the map method worked really, really well to facilitate conversations. And then what I think was really important when we got back to the forming of the exhibition, how those areas were defined in the exhibition space almost became a kind of mirror of what I'd been doing in the county. So we had beside the sea, by the fireside in the pub, at the county show, on the village green. We tried to kind of emulate, I suppose, a kind of version of a Cumbria, from urban to quaint village to coastal to little kind of community kind of gathering points like the pub. And I think we did. I think that served us it served a genuine celebration of Cumbria in all its facets. I would say the way we kind of framed the sharing of the work in the exhibition. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. Can I ask what aspects of the planned project were you think really worked well for you as a facilitator?
I mean, it was a dream of a project. To be honest, it was. It's incredible to, as a practitioner, to come into something like this, where the hard work of the raising of the profile of the project, the idea, and the money is kind of already achieved. That's incredible. And I would say, from my perspective, the strength of the project for me was that Keswick Museum gave me complete autonomy, really, to follow the project and its shifting sands and its shifting leads. Like, I had complete confidence that Keswick Museum were supporting my quite experimental and quite instinct-led sometimes route around how this research project at the first stage was going to go. And that was absolutely fantastic for me, because I think there was a you can imagine, if it had been a very different situation with a different organization, if I'd been very, very governed as to where I must go and who I must, and how many sort of sessions I had to deliver, or how many kind of boxes I needed to tick in terms of contact time or something, that would have been, it would have been fine and I would have done that, but it would have been not such a genuinely meaningful, responsive project around what I was actually finding on the ground. So that was a fantastic strength of the project, that the project allowed for me to really run with this. The other thing I wanted to say was that time, I had a lot of time, as in there were some months I could spend on this whole first stage of the project, and that was extraordinary and unusual. You know, normally you're expected to kind of kind of work wonders in like 3 or 4 weeks or something, and obviously to have the time of several months to really dig deep was absolutely fantastic, and having the creative freedom really to lead on that. And I was very supported by the museum, and I checked in all the time, and they needed me to check in, of course, about where are you up to and how's it going. But it was genuinely a kind of very rich and rewarding project for me, and in return I hope I kind of delivered a rich and rewarding project for the museum. So that worked really well, I would say.
I think we were very lucky with the grant application that we put in, that it was an 20-month project. We knew that the first stage, which was from your point of view, the research and going out, uh, we already had covered within the museum with the Robert Southey and Storytellers, initial Storytellers exhibition, which had already been pre-planned, um, so that we had that time to be able to do that first stage, which we always thought was important, but it's quite difficult to afford to do if you don't have something already in place. Um, and that, from our point of view, it's a very much a learning experience, that you need to give yourself that time at the beginning of a project and potentially have something in place whilst you're doing it, so that you don't just have a big gap. Um,
Yeah.
because otherwise, I think we would have struggled to have got something, as you said, done in a very short time, and it wouldn't have been anywhere near as good. Um, but I wonder if you found it daunting, in effect, having a blank page. We found it daunting, but I certainly, when we interviewed you and employed you as a story researcher, you certainly gave us a really good sense of comfort that you would be able to take this and run with this, and to deliver something at the end of it. What it looked like, we didn't know at that point. But I wondered if that was quite daunting for you, or whether you felt that that was exciting.
It was daunting. I think I feel like I would say I think I feel like the first stage, when things are very open and you've got to start kind of finding things in from nowhere kind of thing. um you know, when I mean, what I mean by that's when you really earn your money. So what I'm saying by that is, that's when I felt like all my wits had to be about me. That's when I worked the hardest, in terms of me going, oh, I'm having to dig deep here and think on my feet what's happening, how I can get this somewhere. So I would say the first stage, the most risky, the hardest, but equally the most exciting, I would agree. And when you've just started to get a few little islands, that's when you're like, oh, I've got somewhere, I've landed on something. And I think because I'm older and I'm quite experienced in making projects around theatre and kind of community arts projects, I've learned to really trust my instinct, and I think I've got quite a kind of honed instinct. So that first stage, yes, completely open and scary, um, but that's when you really go for it. Then the second stage, the pulling together of the work into an exhibition, that's when you use a slightly different bit of your head and you're going, now I'm a practitioner who is used to making exhibitions or theatre shows or whatever, where you go, I'm just making some really clear practical choices now, and I'm editing, and I'm thinking about safety, and I'm thinking about how people move through a space. So that's almost like a different bit of your head. And then the final bit of going out again with the work, once we've kind of achieved the work, I suppose, is again a different aspect of you, which is a more about the kind of, that's like the jester aspect. That's where you're going out, sharing and playing with it to kind of communicate and celebrate it. So for me, in a way, I suppose it did utilize different aspects of my professional practice. I would say the first one was the hardest, though. Yeah.
Thought it might be. Were there any areas, or I would say difficulties, but things that didn't work so well, or challenges that you found with the project and the way it was set up?
Yeah, I mean, there's not so much the way it was set up. I think there's always things that you'd look back on and you'd go, oh, if only, of course. I mean, after everything we've said about how long I had and how fantastic it was that the funding was in place and so on, there's always something you'd think, oh, if only there was more time and more money. I mean, I would have. So I was kind of able to give kind of about 2 days a week to it. That's what I was appointed to do. I mean, it would have been incredible, for example, to have set up a weekly session or something, maybe just at the museum. That could have really, really chimed with loads of things we were trying to achieve, like bringing more people into the museum, having a legacy of maybe a new group coming out of the museum. But something like that would have taken up quite a portion of my time if it was like a weekly thing to have consistency. So, if I'd had 3 days a week, 4 days a week, 5 days a week, I would have done just more and more and more. And there's always that, but there's always going to be that. So I think it wasn't about it not working so well. It's about kind of, oh, if we'd had more time, I could have done more things. And no, not really. Not that anything didn't work so well. I felt like what was fantastic, particularly also with Nicola, the curator at the exhibition. Sorry, my language there. Around her sense of, she was incredibly supportive when it came to the making of the exhibition. So we collaborated really well, where she was extremely open to my suggestions about how we might architecturally sort of design the exhibition and so on. So all these things worked really well. I think I was surprised how hard it was to get anything up and running, but that wasn't a project problem. That was a Cumbria problem, but a Cumbria solution to be found. Yeah.
That's great. Are there any other outcomes that you'd like to tell me about that you can think of specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to share, I think, about finally, really, about how I think it's been a massive awareness raising project in lots of ways. And what I mean by that is awareness raising around all the stuff we've spoken about around stories are everybody's. Everybody can tell, think of, find a story, create a story, and stories are everywhere. Like that is an awareness around story, demonstrating, being visible, like we spoke about, kind of having newspapers, watching other people making a story over there. All that huge awareness raising around that. But also I hope and I think there's been an awareness raising about Keswick Museum loads of times when I've been, hi, I'm Hannah, I'm doing this project, Telt, Keswick Museum. The amount of conversations I've had around that of people going, all right, Keswick Museum, oh yeah, I've been there once, or where is that again? And I think so hopefully I've been hopefully I've been a very dynamic and positive mouthpiece for Keswick Museum out and about, and I think I have, and hopefully that will that will reap rewards for the museum when I'm not there anymore. And the other thing just is a little thing that I did towards the end of the project where I had the opportunity to interview 3 professional people who work with story. I worked with them on the project at different stages, but just to be able to actually interview them and hear what they have to say about story. So, for example, I made a little piece. It wasn't really a film, it was almost like an audio slideshow, called The Story Maker, The Storyteller, and The Story Finder. The story maker being Adam Holton, the flash fiction guy, the storyteller being Emily Hennessy, professional storyteller, and the story finder being Jonathan Cowie of Folk Magazine. And I found that very satisfying that I could give them a platform to share why, and all quite young people actually, just to say all kind of, well, young, middle-aged or young, um, a platform to share why they work in this arena. Um, and that was in the exhibition towards the end, and it's obviously, it's an available thing digitally, and that we are now in Folk Magazine. I'm really thrilled about that it's kind of come full circle. um yeah, so those are some other outcomes just to share.
That's great. We've also, as we're coming towards the end of the project, we've collected the stories into a booklet that we'll have printed. We'll be uploading all of the story audio files onto our YouTube channel, so that people can read the stories, but also hear them, which was important to us, so that they can be listened to. And we've also commissioned a community group in Penrith to create some very short animations that will just kind of illustrate some of the very short stories, as well. So it's a really nice kind of termination of the project, and some legacy items that we can have. So the stories will be available at Keswick Museum. They'll be available on our website and our YouTube channel, and also available at Cumbria Archives, as well. So they're all the things that we've found and collected, kind of hopefully will have legs for the future and inspire other people to continue to tell them and continue to hear them. And it's been absolutely amazing project from our point of view. We've learnt so much, we've gained so much. The work that you've done, Hannah, has been absolutely fantastic. We're thrilled to have you, and the work and everything that you put into it really made it possible for us to deliver all the things that we wanted to deliver. And your hard work and positivity going out across the county, 'cause it's a big old place, and you did so much. It's been absolutely inspiring. So thank you so much for this, and thank you for the interview. Um, and we'll see everyone soon.